It all started with a glance. Just a quick look at our finances. Something I rarely bothered with because Lauren had always been the one in charge of handling the bills, managing the budget, and ensuring everything ran smoothly. She liked it that way, and I trusted her implicitly, or at least I thought I did. That night, as I sat at the kitchen table, my laptop humming quietly in front of me, I wasn't searching for anything in particular. A strange charge had popped up on our credit card statement earlier, a name I didn't recognize, and it nudged at my curiosity. It was a simple, small charge, the kind you might ignore or forget about, but something about it nagged at me. I logged into our joint account, half expecting to find an explanation that would render my suspicion laughable. Maybe it was a gym membership Lauren had forgotten to mention, or perhaps she bought something online and the merchant's name didn't match the purchase. Simple, innocent stuff. But as I scrolled through the recent transactions, a knot formed in my stomach. That one odd charge wasn't alone. There were others, small, innocuous at first glance, but when added up, they painted a different picture. Hotel reservations, high-end restaurants, and purchases from jewelry stores I'd never stepped foot in. My pulse quickened as I dug deeper. Something didn't feel right, so I went further than I ever had before, tracing every line of our finances. And that's when I found it, a separate bank account. It wasn't a joint account. It wasn't even a savings account she'd mentioned in passing. This was something entirely different. It was hers alone, and it was being funded directly by my paycheck. For a moment, I froze. I stared at the screen, hoping I was wrong, that there was some explanation I hadn't considered. My mind raced. Maybe it was a surprise she was planning for me, a vacation, a special gift, or a nest egg for the future. But no, the transactions told a different story. There was no saving, no planning for a shared dream. Lauren wasn't building anything for us. She was spending, and none of it was for me. The hotel reservations stood out first. A pattern emerged. Weekends I'd worked late, trips I'd assumed were for her job. The high-end restaurant charges on nights she claimed she was out with her friends. And the jewelry? I'd never seen her wear it. I stared at the screen as the realization crashed over me like a tidal wave. Lauren wasn't just keeping a secret bank account. She was using it to fund an affair. My hands trembled on the keyboard, but the rage I expected never came. Not at first. Instead, there was an eerie calm. I sat back in my chair, exhaling slowly. It all made sense now. The late nights, the hushed phone calls, the faint scent of cologne that wasn't mine lingering on her clothes. I'd noticed it all, but I dismissed it, trusting her, believing in her. And she had betrayed me. For a moment, I entertained the idea of confronting her right then and there. Marching into the bedroom, shoving the evidence in her face, demanding answers. But as quickly as the thought formed, I dismissed it. That would give her the upper hand, a chance to lie, to manipulate, to twist the truth into something that might cast doubt in my mind. No, that wouldn't do. Instead, I smiled. It wasn't a smile born of happiness or amusement. It was the kind of smile that forms when something deep inside you snaps, the calm before the storm. Lauren had no idea I knew. She had no clue that her perfect little charade was beginning to crumble. And I wasn't about to tip her off. No, if Lauren wanted to play games, I'd play along. I'd let her think she was still in control, that she had the upper hand. But behind the scenes, I would prepare. I would watch, I would wait, and when the time was right, I would strike. Because this wasn't just about her infidelity. It wasn't just about her betrayal of our vows. This was about something deeper. Her taking my trust, my hard-earned money, and my love, and using it to build a life with someone else. That night, as Lauren slept soundly beside me, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. The secret bank account was just the beginning. I needed to know everything. Who was he? How long had this been going on? And most importantly, how could I make sure that when the dust settled, she and her little boy toy were left with nothing but regret? I reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. How deep does this rabbit hole go, Lauren? I whispered under my breath. She stirred slightly but didn't wake. I smiled again, my resolve hardening. She had no idea what was coming. I didn't sleep that night. While Lauren dreamed peacefully beside me, I dove headfirst into the digital abyss, combing through every shred of evidence I could find. If she thought she could hide something like this, she didn't realize just how meticulous I could be when I smelled betrayal. It started with her bank account. I examined every transaction, dissecting the trail like a forensic accountant. Each payment was a piece of the puzzle, and together, they painted a picture that was clearer and uglier than I could have imagined. There were cash withdrawals every Thursday at noon. I checked my calendar and realized those were the same days she claimed she had work lunches. There were hotel stays, always in the same part of town, and always when I was conveniently out late for work or traveling for a conference. Then there were the gifts, expensive jewelry, high-end clothing, and electronics, all purchased under my name but delivered to locations I'd never visited. My chest tightened as I dug deeper. The thought of her parading around with another man, using my money to fund their little escapades, made my blood boil. But I wasn't done yet. I needed to know who. It didn't take long to find him. His name was Zach Carter. A quick search on social media pulled up his profile. He was a personal trainer at Lauren's gym, and everything about him oozed cockiness. The shirtless selfies, the smug grin, the overly polished captions about discipline and hard work. It was all I could do to keep from smashing my laptop screen. Zach wasn't just younger. He was the kind of guy who thought the world owed him something simply because he had a gym membership and a six-pack. And here he was, strutting into my life, my marriage, my wallet, like he'd earned it. I wanted to storm into his gym, find him mid-rep, and make him regret ever laying eyes on my wife. I wanted to break every bone in his smug little body, but I didn't, because I wasn't going to let anger dictate my actions. No, this required precision, planning, and patience. I cataloged every piece of information I could find about Zach. His work schedule, his travel habits, his social circle. I combed through his posts, noting every detail that could be useful later. And then I turned my attention back to Lauren. She came home late that night, her face glowing as she stared at her phone. I could see the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corners of her lips, the kind of smile she hadn't given me in months. "Hey," she said, barely looking up as she walked past me. "Hey," I replied, keeping my voice calm. "How was your day?" She glanced at me, her expression unreadable for a split second before she forced a casual smile. "Busy. You know how it is." I nodded, playing the part of the clueless, trusting husband. But inside, I was seething. The lies were so casual, so effortless, as if I were too dense to notice. As if I were nothing more than a wallet and a warm body to come home to. I let her settle into her evening routine, pretending to scroll through my own phone while she texted furiously beside me. Every so often, she'd glance in my direction, probably to make sure I wasn't paying attention. I made a show of yawning and putting my phone down, feigning disinterest. "Long day?" she asked, almost sounding concerned. "Yeah," I said, stretching. "I think I'm just gonna head to bed early." She nodded, and I could feel her relief as I walked away. But I didn't go to bed. Instead, I sat in my office, piecing together the rest of the digital trail. I pulled her work emails, using the access I'd set up years ago when she needed help syncing accounts. There it was, flirty messages exchanged under the guise of professionalism. Inside jokes, compliments, even the occasional suggestive emoji. The messages were always timed perfectly, late mornings, lunch breaks, evenings when I was occupied. I stared at the screen, every word like a knife to the gut. Lauren was clever. I'd give her that. She covered her tracks well, but not well enough. I took screenshots of everything, saving them to a hidden folder on my laptop. I printed copies, too, just in case. By the time I was done, I had enough evidence to blow their little fantasy world to pieces. When I finally crawled into bed, Lauren was already asleep. She looked peaceful, as if the weight of her deceit had no effect on her. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. She thought she had me fooled. She thought she could live this double life indefinitely, draining my resources while sneaking around with her boy toy. But she had no idea what was coming. I wasn't just going to confront her. I wasn't just going to end it. I was going to make sure that when this was over, she'd regret every single choice she made. And as I drifted off to sleep, one thought kept me going. Revenge, when done right, isn't loud. It's a quiet, calculated storm that leaves nothing but destruction in its wake. Lauren had started this, but I was going to finish it. In the days that followed, I realized something. Anger, on its own, is useless. Anger burns hot and fast, leaving you empty, but cold calculation? That's where the real power lies. Lauren had handed me every weapon I needed on a silver platter, and she didn't even know it. Her arrogance, her carelessness, her overconfidence. They were all cracks in the foundation she thought was solid, and I was ready to bring the whole thing crumbling down. The first thing I did was gather evidence. Real, irrefutable proof. Not just for my own satisfaction, but for what I had planned. I started with her work emails. Using the cloned account I'd set up, I spent hours combing through her inbox. The flirty messages with Zach were just the tip of the iceberg. There were attachments, photos, confirmations for hotel bookings, and even a shared itinerary for an out-of-town weekend I had no knowledge of. She wasn't just being reckless. She was practically begging to be caught. Next, I turned my attention to Zach. His social media was a treasure trove of information. He was one of those people who broadcasted his life to the world. Every workout, every meal, every smug grin captured in painstaking detail. I tracked his movements, noting when he was at the gym, when he was out of town, and, most importantly, when he was vulnerable. But I wasn't satisfied with what I could dig up on my own. I wanted more, every scrap of dirt, every skeleton in his closet. So, I hired a private investigator. It wasn't cheap, but then again, neither were the hotel stays and jewelry Lauren had been buying. If my money was going to be spent, it might as well be on something worthwhile. The investigator worked quickly. Within days, I had a comprehensive report on Zach. I knew where he lived, who his exes were, and even the details of a few shady business dealings that hadn't quite made it to the authorities. He wasn't just arrogant. He was a ticking time bomb waiting to go off. Every night, Lauren lay beside me, scrolling through her phone, texting him. She probably thought I was too clueless, too trusting to notice. She didn't see the cold rage building beneath the surface, the storm I was carefully crafting. And then, I set my trap. One morning over breakfast, as she sipped her coffee and scrolled through her phone, I said casually, "By the way, I'll be out of town next weekend. Business trip. Last-minute thing." I watched her closely, and there it was, the flicker of excitement in her eyes before she quickly masked it with concern. "Oh," she said, feigning disappointment. "That's sudden. How long will you be gone?" "Just the weekend," I replied. "Shouldn't be too bad." She nodded, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. I could almost see the gears turning in her mind, planning, calculating. I left it at that, letting her think she'd gotten away with something. The next few days were a flurry of quiet preparation. I arranged everything down to the last detail. I made sure the house's security cameras were operational and discreetly installed a few extras in key areas. I synchronized everything to my tablet so I could monitor in real time. Lauren went about her week as if nothing had changed, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing just beneath the surface. On the morning of my so-called business trip, I packed a small suitcase and kissed her goodbye. She smiled sweetly, wishing me a safe journey. I drove out of the neighborhood, turning the corner before circling back and parking a few blocks away. From there, I watched the house, waiting for the inevitable. It didn't take long. By mid-afternoon, Lauren started preparing. She cleaned the house meticulously, cooked what smelled like an elaborate meal, and even brought out the wine glasses we hadn't used in months. By the time the evening rolled around, I was seething, but I kept my composure. This wasn't about impulse. This was about strategy. When the clock struck 7:45 p.m., I saw him. Zach pulled up in his flashy car, all confidence and swagger, as if he owned the place. He knocked on the door, and Lauren greeted him with a kiss that made my stomach churn. I watched them laugh, drink, and settle into my home. My life, as if I didn't exist. But they were about to learn just how wrong they were. By 8:15 p.m., I'd had enough. I stepped out of my car, locked it with a quiet click, and walked toward the house. The cool evening air felt electric, the anticipation building with every step. When I opened the door, I didn't slam it. I didn't yell or make a scene. I simply walked in, calm and composed. Lauren turned first, her laughter dying instantly as her face drained of color. Zach, oblivious, stood up, a confused smile on his face. "Hey, man," he said, extending a hand as if we were old friends. I took his hand, gripping it firmly, and then I snapped his wrist like a twig. The sound of the bone breaking was satisfying, a sharp crack that silenced the room. Zach screamed, clutching his mangled hand, while Lauren rushed forward, her face a mask of panic. "Matthew!" she cried, her voice trembling. "What are you doing?" I turned to her, my calm smile never wavering. "What am I doing?" I repeated. "I'm just getting started." The silence after Zach's scream was deafening. It hung in the air, thick and suffocating, like the tension in the room. Lauren's face was pale, her hands trembling as she reached out toward him, but she stopped short when she saw the look in my eyes. "Matthew," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "please, just save it." I cut her off, my tone calm but laced with cold steel. Zach groaned, clutching his broken wrist. His bravado shattered as he sank back into the chair. His eyes darted between me and Lauren, panic written all over his face. "I don't know what you think is going on here, man, but—" I turned to him sharply, and he froze mid-sentence. "You don't know what I think?" I said, stepping closer. "Let me make it clear for you." Grabbing him by the collar, I yanked him forward, forcing him to meet my gaze. "You walk into my house, eat my food, drink my wine, and think you can get away with it?" Zach stammered, his face a mix of fear and confusion. "I didn't know. She said you were out of town?" I finished for him, my smile twisting into something darker. "Yeah, I bet she did." Lauren stepped forward then, her hands raised as if she could calm the storm brewing in the room. "Matthew, stop this. Please, let him go. We can talk about this. Talk?" I turned to her, releasing Zach abruptly. He slumped back, clutching his wrist, his breathing shallow. "You want to talk, Lauren? Fine. Let's talk." I reached into my pocket and pulled out my tablet, tapping the screen a few times before turning it toward them. The footage was crystal clear. Lauren and Zach together in our house, laughing, kissing, and more. It played like a sick montage, each clip a dagger to the heart, but I didn't look away. Zach's face went ghost white as he watched, and Lauren, she crumbled. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, covering her mouth with both hands. "Matthew, I snapped, my voice cutting through her weak attempt at an explanation. "Don't even try." Zach, clearly realizing the gravity of the situation, tried to stand, but I shoved him back down into the chair. "You're not going anywhere," I growled. "Not until I'm done." Turning back to Lauren, I let the tablet fall to my side, the screen going dark. "How long?" I demanded. She hesitated, her mouth opening and closing as if she couldn't form the words. "How long?" I repeated, my voice rising slightly. "6 months," she finally whispered, tears streaming down her face. 6 months. Half a year of lies, of deceit, of her playing me for a fool. I nodded slowly, letting the weight of her confession sink in. Then, I turned to Zach. "And you," I said, my tone dripping with disdain. "You think you can just waltz into another man's life and take what doesn't belong to you?" He didn't answer, his eyes wide with terror. "Here's the thing, Zach," I continued, leaning in close. "It's one thing to sleep with another man's wife. It's disgusting, but it happens. But to use my money to do it? That's a whole other level of stupidity." I pulled out a folder I'd prepared earlier, tossing it onto the table in front of him. Inside were printed copies of hotel receipts, restaurant bills, and even the jewelry invoices, all traced back to my accounts. "Recognize these?" I asked. Zach glanced at the papers, his hands shaking too much to pick them up. "Look at them," I barked, and he flinched, finally reaching out with his uninjured hand to fumble through the folder. His face fell as he took in the evidence, his lips moving soundlessly as if trying to come up with an excuse. "Yeah, that's what I thought," I said, stepping back and crossing my arms. "You're pathetic." Lauren was still on the floor, sobbing quietly. Matthew, please, she begged. I made a mistake. I was stupid. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Didn't mean for it to go this far? I cut her off, laughing bitterly. You think that makes it better? You think that excuses any of this? She didn't answer, her tears falling harder as she curled into herself. I looked at them both, Lauren, broken and crying, and Zach, a pathetic shell of the arrogant man who had walked into my home just an hour ago. And I felt nothing. No pity, no sadness, no remorse. Just the cold satisfaction of knowing they were finally seeing the consequences of their actions. I took a deep breath, my voice calm again as I said, "This is just the beginning." Then, I turned to Zach one last time. "Get out of my house." He hesitated, his eyes darting to Lauren, as if looking for her permission. "Now," I barked, and he scrambled to his feet, clutching his wrist as he stumbled toward the door. As he left, I turned back to Lauren. "You," I said, my voice low but firm, "aren't going anywhere." Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't care. This was far from over. The door slammed shut behind Zach, but his pathetic cries still lingered in the air. I stood there, watching Lauren huddled on the floor, her face buried in her hands. She looked so small, so defeated. Part of me wanted to let that be enough, to leave her there, broken by her own choices. But I wasn't done. Not yet. Lauren's sobs were loud, uneven, a mixture of fear and regret. "Matthew," she whispered, her voice muffled by her hands, "please. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen." "Sorry?" I echoed, my voice calm but icy. I crouched down to her level, making sure she could see the cold resolve in my eyes. "You're sorry because you got caught. That's all this is to you." She shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. "No, save it," I snapped, standing back up. "We're past the point of apologies, Lauren. You didn't just cheat. You dragged me through the mud, used my money, disrespected my home." I grabbed my tablet again, pulling up the damning trail of evidence. Their emails, the bank transactions, the hotel receipts. I turned the screen toward her, letting her see it all. "Explain this," I said, my tone sharp. Lauren lifted her head slowly, her face pale and streaked with tears. She stared at the screen, her mouth opening and closing as if searching for the right words. But nothing came. "You can't, can you?" I pressed. She shook her head weakly. "I didn't think—" "No, you didn't," I interrupted, cutting her off. "You didn't think about the lies, the betrayal, the humiliation. You didn't think about me." Lauren's hands clutched at her chest, her sobs growing louder. "It was a mistake, Matthew. I got caught up in something stupid. Please, you have to believe me." "Believe you?" I laughed bitterly. "After all of this? After watching you welcome that idiot into my house, into our life? You want me to believe you?" She nodded, her desperation evident. "I'll do anything to fix this. Just tell me what to do." I stared at her for a long moment, letting her words hang in the air. Part of me wanted to believe her, to let this be the end of it. But then I remembered the emails, the hotel stays, the nights I'd sat alone while she was off with him. "Fix this," I repeated, my voice colder than ever. "You don't fix something like this, Lauren. You endure it. And now, it's your turn." I grabbed my phone and dialed a number. It rang twice before the person on the other end picked up. "Yeah, it's me," I said. "You're still outside, right?" The doorbell rang moments later, and Lauren's head shot up, her eyes wide with fear. Who is that?" she stammered. I didn't answer her. Instead, I walked to the door and opened it, revealing the private investigator I'd hired. He was holding a thick manila envelope, his expression as neutral as ever. "Everything's here," he said, handing me the envelope. "Good," I replied, taking it from him. Lauren's face went even paler as I walked back into the living room, flipping through the contents of the envelope. Inside were photos, documents, and even more proof of her betrayal. I tossed the envelope onto the coffee table in front of her. "Here's the full story," I said. "Every lie, every secret, every betrayal, all documented." She stared at the envelope like it was a ticking time bomb. "Matthew, please," she begged, her voice trembling. Don't do this. You did this, I shot back. I'm just finishing it. She tried to grab the envelope, but I slapped her hand away. This isn't yours anymore, I said firmly. You forfeited your right to privacy the moment you brought him into our lives. Lauren's sobs turned into wails, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I thought about Zach, about his smug smile, his casual arrogance. I thought about the nights I'd spent wondering why things felt off, why Lauren seemed so distant. I turned my attention back to her, my expression hardening. You're going to sit here, I said, my voice low but commanding, and you're going to think about every choice you made that brought us here. Every lie, every betrayal, every moment you spent with him. Lauren nodded weakly, tears streaming down her face. And when I come back, I continued, we'll talk about what happens next. Without waiting for a response, I grabbed my jacket and walked out the door. Zach was still limping down the street, clutching his wrist and muttering curses under his breath. I watched him for a moment, debating whether to finish what I'd started. But no, that would be too easy. Instead, I got into my car, the engine roaring to life as I drove away. Lauren thought she'd seen the worst of it, but this was only the beginning. When I returned home later that night, the house was silent. The air felt heavy, thick with the weight of what had transpired. Lauren was still sitting in the living room, her face pale and tear-streaked. She looked up as I entered, but there was no defiance left in her eyes, just fear and regret. Matthew, she started, her voice trembling. I held up a hand, silencing her immediately. Don't, not another word. I walked past her and into the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water. I needed a moment to collect myself, to ensure I didn't let my anger spiral out of control. When I finally returned to the living room, Lauren was still frozen in place, her hands clutching her knees as if holding herself together. I sat down across from her, the envelope of evidence still sitting ominously on the coffee table between us. Do you know what the worst part of this is? I asked, my voice calm but cold. She shook her head, her lips trembling. It's not the cheating, I continued, leaning forward. It's not even the money. It's the fact that you thought you could get away with it, that you looked me in the eye, day after day, and lied without a second thought. I didn't mean to hurt you, she whispered, her voice cracking. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. Didn't mean to hurt me? Lauren, you didn't just hurt me. You destroyed everything we built together. For what? A fling with a personal trainer? She flinched at my words, tears spilling down her cheeks. I was stupid, she said, her voice barely audible. I wasn't thinking. No, I interrupted sharply. You were thinking. You were thinking about yourself, about your excitement, your thrill, your little fantasy. You just didn't think you'd get caught. She opened her mouth to respond, but I wasn't finished. Let me make one thing clear, I said, my tone firm. You've dug your grave, Lauren, and now you're going to lie in it. I reached for my laptop, setting it on the table and opening the folder I'd prepared. Lauren's breath hitched as the screen came to life, displaying security footage from our home. It was all there. Her and Zach, laughing, kissing, and more. Footage from the living room, the kitchen, even our bedroom. Her face crumpled as she watched, her sobs growing louder with each passing second. Please, she begged, reaching out toward me. Please, Matthew, don't do this. I ignored her, letting the footage play. This, I said, gesturing to the screen, is what you've reduced our marriage to. A series of lies and betrayals, all caught on camera. Lauren collapsed onto the floor, her hands clutching her head. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she sobbed. I slammed the laptop shut, the sound echoing through the room. And yet, here we are. For a moment, the only sound was her crying. I leaned back in my chair, letting her wallow in her guilt. Then, I stood up, pulling my wedding ring off my finger. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with panic. Please, Matthew, she whispered. Don't leave me. I threw the ring onto the coffee table, the metal clinking against the glass. You left me a long time ago, Lauren, I said, my voice cold. You just didn't have the decency to tell me. Her sobs turned into wails as she collapsed fully onto the floor. I grabbed my tablet and opened the email draft I'd prepared earlier. With a few taps, I sent the evidence to a list of recipients: her family, her closest friends, her boss. By the time she looked up at me, it was already done. What did you do?" she stammered. "I told the truth," I said simply. "Something you couldn't do." Her face crumpled as she realized the magnitude of what had just happened. "Matthew, no," she whispered, shaking her head. "You can't." "Oh, I can," I said, cutting her off. "And I did. By morning, everyone you know will see you for what you really are." She tried to get up, but her legs gave out beneath her. "Why are you doing this to me?" she sobbed. I crouched down beside her, forcing her to meet my gaze. "Because you deserve it," I said simply. Her cries filled the room as I stood up, grabbing my jacket and heading for the door. "Where are you going?" she called after me, her voice desperate. "Out," I said without looking back. "Please, Matthew," she screamed. "Don't leave me like this." I paused at the doorway, turning to look at her one last time. "You ruined this marriage, Lauren," I said. "Now you get to live with the consequences." And with that, I walked out, her sobs echoing behind me. It wasn't over. Not yet. But Lauren had just experienced the first taste of what was coming. And I was going to make sure she felt every ounce of pain she'd inflicted on me, tenfold. The drive gave me time to clear my head and plot my next move. I wasn't done with Lauren yet, not by a long shot. Tonight was just the beginning. If she thought a few tears and some desperate pleas would make me falter, she clearly didn't know me as well as she thought. The secret bank account had been bothering me since the moment I found it. Every charge, every transaction was another stab in the back. It wasn't just about the affair. It was about her using my hard-earned money to fund it. That was the part one couldn't forgive. When I got back home, the house was quiet. Lauren was still in the living room, curled up on the couch like a broken doll. Her sobs had subsided into quiet sniffles, and she didn't even look up as I walked past her and into my office. I shut the door behind me, locking it for good measure. Then, I sat at my desk and opened my laptop, pulling up the banking portal Lauren thought she had so cleverly hidden from me. The account stared back at me, the balance taunting me like a slap to the face. Thousands of dollars, my dollars, siphoned away without my knowledge or consent. Not anymore. I'd spent weeks gathering the information I needed, quietly observing Lauren's patterns, learning her passwords, and setting up backdoor access to everything she thought was private. She had no idea how much control I already had. With a few clicks, I drained the account. Every last cent disappeared into a new account under my name, an account she couldn't touch. The satisfaction was instant. This was my money, earned through years of hard work and sacrifice. She didn't deserve a single penny of it, but I wasn't done. Lauren's financial recklessness extended beyond the affair. The private investigator had uncovered something even more damning: embezzlement. She'd been skimming funds from her company, funneling the money into her secret account to keep up with the lavish lifestyle she built with Zach. It was all there: falsified invoices, fake vendor accounts, and payouts that conveniently disappeared into her pocket. The evidence was undeniable, and I wasn't about to let it slide. I composed an email to her employer, attaching every piece of evidence I had. The subject line was simple: urgent, employee misconduct. Before hitting send, I paused, thinking about the fallout. By morning, Lauren would be jobless, disgraced, and potentially facing legal action. And I didn't feel an ounce of pity. I hit send. Leaning back in my chair, I took a deep breath, letting the weight of what I'd just done settle over me. This wasn't revenge, it was justice. Lauren had spent months lying, stealing, and betraying me, and now she was finally going to face the consequences. I walked back into the living room, where Lauren still sat, her eyes red and puffy. She looked up at me, her expression a mixture of fear and desperation. "Matthew," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "please, can we just talk? Can we fix this?" I stared at her for a long moment, the woman I once loved now a stranger to me. "There's nothing to fix," I said coldly. She flinched at the sharpness of my tone, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I know I hurt you," she said, her voice trembling. But we can work through this. We can— Stop, I said, cutting her off. Just stop. I leaned against the doorframe, crossing my arms as I stared her down. You don't get to plead for forgiveness, Lauren. Not after everything you've done. Not after you've lied to my face, betrayed our marriage, and used my money to fund your affair. She opened her mouth to argue, but I held up a hand. And don't think I don't know about the embezzlement, I added, my voice laced with venom. Her eyes widened in shock, her face draining of color. What? What are you talking about? She stammered. I smirked, pulling out my phone and tapping the screen a few times. I held it up, showing her the email I just sent to her employer. Her breath hitched, her hands flying to her mouth as she read the subject line. Matthew, no, she whispered, shaking her head. You can't do this. Oh, I can, I said, my smirk growing. And I did. By morning, your little scheme will be exposed, and you'll be out of a job. Her sobs started again, loud and messy, but I felt nothing. Why are you doing this to me? She wailed, her voice breaking. Because you deserve it, I said simply. Lauren collapsed back onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. You've destroyed everything, she sobbed. No, Lauren, I said, my voice calm and steady. You destroyed everything. I'm just making sure you can't hurt anyone else. With that, I turned and walked away, leaving her to wallow in the ruins of her own making. The door closed behind me, but I knew this wasn't the end. Lauren's fall from grace was far from over, and I was going to make sure she felt the full weight of her actions. Because in my book, justice wasn't just about payback. It was about making sure they never recovered. Morning broke quietly, but the storm I had unleashed was already raging in Lauren's world. I sat in my office with my coffee, scrolling through the social media chaos that was slowly spreading. My email to her employer had been the first domino, and by now, that single push had toppled her carefully curated life. Her family had called. Our mutual friends had seen the evidence. Even her coworkers, the ones she always boasted about impressing, had been copied on the email. The reactions were swift and brutal. My phone buzzed with messages and calls, but I ignored most of them. Lauren had spent months living a double life, and now the truth was doing what it always does, burning everything down. Lauren stumbled into the living room a few hours later, looking like a ghost of herself. Her hair was unkempt, her face blotchy from crying all night. She held her phone tightly, her hands trembling as she stared at the screen. What did you do? She whispered, her voice shaking. I didn't even look up from my laptop. What needed to be done? Her breath hitched, and she sank onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. They've all seen it, she sobbed. My family, my boss, my friends, everyone. They're all calling me, asking me what's going on. I finally glanced up, taking in her disheveled appearance. Good, I said coldly. Now they know the real you. Lauren's sobs grew louder as she rocked back and forth, clutching her phone like it was a lifeline. Matthew, you didn't have to do this, she pleaded. You didn't have to humiliate me like this. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. Didn't I? After everything you've done, the lies, the betrayal, the way you paraded that idiot around while using my money, you think you're the victim now? She looked up at me, her eyes bloodshot and filled with desperation. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But this is too much. Too much? I repeated, standing up and walking toward her. Lauren, the only thing that's too much is your audacity. You didn't just betray me. You spit on everything we built together. And now, you're finally facing the consequences. Her tears didn't move me. Not anymore. I grabbed my phone and opened the group chats we shared with friends and family. With a few taps, I sent the message I drafted earlier. To everyone who thought Lauren was the perfect wife, here's the truth. Attached were screenshots of the bank transactions, the emails with Zach, and the security footage from our house. The message was brutal, concise, and devastating. Within minutes, the replies started pouring in. Shock, disbelief, condemnation. Lauren's phone buzzed relentlessly as the fallout spread like wildfire. She picked it up, scrolling through the messages, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. Why are you doing this? she cried, looking up at me. Why are you ruining my life? I leaned down, meeting her tearful gaze. I'm not ruining your life, Lauren, I said softly. You did that all on your own. I'm just making sure everyone sees the truth. She shook her head, her sobs turning into wails. Please, Matthew. Please, stop this. I straightened up, my expression unyielding. You didn't stop when you had the chance. You didn't stop when you were lying to me, stealing from me, betraying me. Why should I stop now? Lauren collapsed onto the couch, her body racked with sobs. But I didn't care. I walked out of the room, leaving her to face the storm she had created. In my office, I poured myself another cup of coffee and sat down, scrolling through the endless stream of reactions to the truth bomb I had dropped. The fallout was swift and unforgiving. Her family was furious, their messages filled with disappointment and anger. Her friends, the ones who had always praised her perfect life, were stunned into silence. And her boss? An email popped up in my inbox, confirming that Lauren had been fired effective immediately. By the end of the day, Lauren had lost everything. Her reputation, her career, her carefully constructed facade. It was all gone. And I felt nothing but satisfaction. Because this wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. Lauren had spent months living a lie, building a fantasy world on the foundation of betrayal and deceit. And now, that world was gone, reduced to ashes by the truth she had so desperately tried to hide. As the sun set, I sat back in my chair, sipping my coffee as I watched the chaos unfold. Lauren's world had collapsed, and she had no one to blame but herself. And this was only the beginning. Lauren's sobbing had quieted by the next morning, but the tension in the house was suffocating. The air was thick with the weight of what she had lost, her reputation, her job, her family's respect. I had stripped her of everything she had once held over me, but I wasn't finished. Not yet. This wasn't about petty revenge. This was about ensuring that Lauren paid for every ounce of pain she had caused me. And now, it was time to take the fight to the courts. I had already consulted my lawyer before I even revealed the affair. She was sharp, ruthless, and the kind of person who didn't just win cases, she decimated the opposition. I'd given her everything. The evidence of the affair, the embezzlement, the financial discrepancies. She had turned it into a rock-solid case. When Lauren finally emerged from the bedroom that morning, she looked like a shell of her former self. Her eyes were hollow, her face pale. She barely glanced at me as she sat down at the dining table. "Matthew," she said softly, her voice hoarse, "we need to talk." I folded my arms and leaned back in my chair, waiting. "I know you're angry," she began, her hands shaking. "And I know I've hurt you. But dragging this out, going to court, it's not going to help either of us. Can't we just work something out?" I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "Work something out? Lauren, you don't get to negotiate after everything you've done. This isn't a conversation. This is me taking back what's mine." Her lip quivered, and for a moment, she looked like she might argue. But she knew better. "I'll fight you in court," she said finally, her voice trembling. "I'll get half of everything, Matthew. The house, the savings, everything. That's how this works." I smirked, reaching for the folder I had prepared the night before. "You think so?" I said, sliding it across the table toward her. She hesitated, her hands hovering over the folder before she finally opened it. Inside were the legal filings, a detailed list of the assets she had stolen, the fraudulent transactions she had made, and the evidence tying her directly to the embezzlement at her job. Her face paled as she flipped through the pages, her hands shaking so badly that the papers almost slipped from her grasp. "Matthew," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What is this?" "It's the end of your little game," I said coldly. "I'm suing you for fraud, Lauren. Every cent you took from me, every lie you told, it's all in there. You're not getting half of anything. In fact, you'll be lucky if you walk away with the clothes on your back." She stared at me, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You can't do this," she said, her voice cracking. "You can't take everything from me." I leaned forward, meeting her gaze with an icy smile. "You took everything from me first," I said. "This is just me evening the score." Lauren's hands flew to her mouth, her sobs breaking through the silence. "You don't have to do this," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "Please, Matthew. I'll do anything. Just don't ruin me." "You ruined yourself," I replied, standing up and grabbing my coat. "The court date is in 2 weeks. I suggest you find a good lawyer." I left her sitting there, her cries echoing behind me as I walked out the door. 2 weeks later, the courtroom was packed. Lauren sat at the defendant's table, her face pale and drawn, while I sat across from her with my lawyer, who was already tearing her defense apart. The evidence spoke for itself. The affair, the stolen money, the embezzlement. Lauren's lawyer tried to paint her as a victim, claiming that she had made mistakes but didn't deserve to lose everything. But the judge wasn't buying it. When the verdict was finally delivered, it was swift and merciless. Lauren was ordered to repay every cent she had taken, with interest. She was stripped of any claim to the house, the savings, or my assets. She walked out of the courtroom that day with nothing but the clothes on her back. Meanwhile, I walked out with my dignity and my freedom. That evening, I stood on the balcony of my new penthouse, looking out at the city skyline. The air was crisp, the kind that felt clean and refreshing after a storm. Lauren had lost everything, but I didn't feel guilty. Not for a second. She had made her choices, and now she was living with the consequences. A text buzzed on my phone. I glanced at it, half expecting another round of desperate pleas from Lauren. But it wasn't her. It was Zach. "You'll pay for what you did to me," the message read. I smirked, shaking my head. Zach didn't scare me. He was just another casualty in the war Lauren had started. I deleted the message and set my phone down, taking a deep breath. The battle was over, and I had won. 1 year later, I stood on the balcony of my penthouse, the crisp evening air brushing against my face as I sipped from a glass of whiskey. The view stretched far into the city, its lights flickering like stars against the night sky. It was a reminder of how far I had come. A life rebuilt, free of deceit and betrayal. Lauren? She was just a memory now, a painful chapter one had closed. The fallout of her choices had been devastating for her. Fired from her job, ostracized by her family, and burdened with a debt she couldn't pay, she had been forced to move in with her sister in a cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city. I'd heard whispers that she was trying to rebuild her life, but without a career or reputation, the climb would be steep and lonely. As for Zach, the last I heard, he was still attending physical therapy. I didn't regret what I did to him, not one bit. He had been a willing participant in the destruction of my marriage, and he paid the price. Life, for me, had never been better. I'd poured myself into my career, rising to new heights and achieving things I never thought possible. The penthouse was a symbol of that success, a sanctuary I had built with my own hands. But it wasn't just about material success. I had found peace. No more lies, no more betrayal, just me, my goals, and the freedom to live life on my own terms. One evening, as I sat in my living room, scrolling through emails, my phone buzzed with a notification. I glanced at the screen and froze. It was a message from Lauren. I hadn't heard from her in months, not since the court proceedings ended and she walked out of the courtroom with nothing. I hesitated for a moment before opening the message. "I miss you. Can we talk?" I stared at the words, my mind racing. Was she serious? After everything she had done, did she really think there was any path back to me? I took a deep breath, my emotions steady as I typed my response. No. I hit send and immediately blocked her number. Lauren had been a parasite, draining me of my happiness, my trust, and my love. I had given her everything, and she had thrown it all away. There was no room for her in my life anymore, not even as a passing thought. That night, I sat on the balcony, staring at the stars as I reflected on everything that had happened. Revenge hadn't been the goal. Justice had, and I had achieved it. Lauren and Zach were reminders of a painful chapter in my life, but they no longer held power over me. I had taken back control, rebuilt my life, and come out stronger. Because the best revenge isn't breaking bones or burning bridges. It's moving on, thriving, and making sure the people who wronged you can never catch up. As I raised my glass to the city skyline, I smiled. The storm was over. and I was finally free.